So let's talk about Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender. Now I remember back when it was first announced that Avatar: The Last Airbender was going to be getting another live-action adaptation but in the form of a TV show, I remembered having mixed feelings about it. Where there was a part of me that, like everyone else, was rather skeptical about it because of the high probability of it choosing to do its own thing with the source material, like that M. Night Shyamalan film that nobody talks about. And make no mistake, it certainly does have its moments of doing that in spots, but it actually portrayed a lot of things from the original series in an interesting way. And there was another part of me that was really curious about how it would work exactly. Because of course we're all used to seeing stuff in live action be portrayed the same way as an intellectual property. That's boring. But what's not so boring is seeing an intellectual property, especially one that's animated, be portrayed with a certain level of artistry in live action. Not only that, but also to me Avatar as a concept had always looked like an interesting expression of our reality. And this series absolutely delivered on that. It's not perfect though. I can see why a lot of people were rather critical towards it, because writing-wise, it made some pretty outlandish choices, such as having Aang be more conscientious than negligent like his animated counterpart, having Sokka be anti-sexist, excluding Sozin's comet from the story, and having certain parts of the story be crammed together. There are times in this series where this is all portrayed exceptionally well, and there are times where it's not. I point to the Northern Water Tribe and Kyoshi episodes as the biggest examples of this, where you can tell that they cut out other parts of the story that didn't really needed to be removed. I'm not an expert in storyboarding, but the reason why the story of the original series was so good was because it had a storyboard that was 100% original and consistent. And there are times in this series where you can tell that the production crew just rushed through the storyboard. They very clearly could have chosen to go in a completely different direction with this, but they chose to have this be a reboot, which, as we all know, doesn't always work very well in live action. However, it is possible to have a live-action reboot/remake of a pre-existing intellectual property be 100% faithful, and unfortunately this live-action reboot dropped the ball on that. But I don't blame this on the production crew. I blame this on those saying that an accurate depiction of Avatar: The Last Airbender is not possible because of its length of storytelling. I understand the temptation of wanting to offer something new to a pre-existing piece of media, as there are some in existence that rightfully deserve that for the better, but intellectual property loyalty is always important to take note of in any adaptation regardless of one's feelings on the matter. The story of the animated iteration of Avatar may not have been 100% consistent. There were certainly some filler episodes here and there, but it still told a good story with these characters. Whereas this series did not tell a good story with these characters. Hell, I'm still trying to figure out why in the Astro would they cut out a good chunk of Sokka's development in the entire series. They butchered Sokka's relationship with Kyoshi so much that it's not even funny. And I'm sorry to say this, but Zuko's battle with his father in this series sucks. It sucks so bad. Because they play it up as if Ozai is a benefactor to his son when really he has always been the complete opposite. They portray it as if Ozai is giving his son tough love when, as the original series points out, he doesn't love his son at all. He despises him. And call me crazy, but I'm pretty sure a despised father figure would do more than this kind of damage to his own son when pissed. That being said, Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of those intellectual properties you just can't change in any capacity. It has been written and portrayed a certain way for a reason. And that reason is that it already is interesting on its own. Reinventing the wheel on it is rather redundant, especially when knowing how interesting it truly would have been with being 100% faithful. So the lack of consistency in being faithful to the original series is one thing I will agree is a legitimate criticism. Another thing that I feel this series dropped the ball on was with the casting. I'm not a fan of the casting choice of Aang in this. I think they went way too far with having him look young and naive. Same with Zuko. I personally think they should have gotten a Hayden Christensen-like actor for this role, because when you watch the original animated series, you'll notice that Zuko is not only a teenager but he's also a legitimate threat. And that's exactly the same kind of character Hayden played in the Star Wars prequels. He not only played a petulant teenager on screen, but a mentally driven one that was intimidating and looked like a threat. And the voice acting of Dante Bosco helped ensured that with his portrayal of Zuko in the animated series. As much as I can't stand Dev Patel's portrayal of Zuko, he at least looked like a physical threat. Whereas Zuko in this series is just portrayed as an angry teenager. A tiny one no less. And look, I'm not in any way saying that Zuko is a big brute of a villain like his father or freaking Bowser, but the dude is a physical threat. I've always pictured Zuko as being the Batman of the Avatar universe where like Bruce he is a tortured individual motivated by vengeance. Vengeance fueled by the rage he had for the sudden treachery that invaded his life. And I don't really see that with Dallas James Liu, which is extremely disappointing. No disrespect towards Dallas, but his take on the character feels more like baby boy Zuko than actual Zuko. And I'm not really all that familiar with Dallas's previous work. My research tells me that apparently he was in Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, which I saw twice, and in those 2 viewings I barely noticed him on screen. So the idea of him being handed the role of Zuko just seems rather crazy to me. As for Aang, again just like with Zuko I don't know too much about the actor who plays him, but one thing's for sure, he looks egregiously too young to be considered an avatar or a savior. Seriously, when I first saw this kid on screen I actually thought he was one of the younger trainees. I know that most of the character is that he is lighthearted and youthful, but what this show failed to understand about this character is that he is more complex than that. The great thing about Aang in the animated series was that he was always inspiring, enough to wheel you into liking him. Here he just comes off as being a goofball. And yes, Aang was like that in the animated series, but he always had some self-awareness and depth to his character. Here it feels like they completely deconstructed all of that for the sake of having Aang be more relatable. However, aside from the cornball writing, the actor himself doesn't look too bad. Maybe I might grow to appreciate his take on the character a bit more as the series moves along. But as of now I actually prefer M. Night Shyamalan's Aang, only because I don't like how this series chose to portray him as being foreign. A concept in which I personally feel is often overplayed in cartoon adaptations. I can understand doing this with anime in live action because a lot of it is typically influenced by the foreign culture, but Avatar: The Last Airbender is not an anime, so it literally has no excuse in that regard. However, if we're throwing The Last Airbender movie into the conversation, in that regard it would make sense why the production crew over at Netflix chose to go the direction they went with the casting of some characters in this series. Obviously they didn't want to repeat the look of M. Night Shyamalan's take on the characters in The Last Airbender without running the risk of being every bit as horrendous as those exact portrayals. They wanted their portrayal of these characters to stand out. And that's understandable, but if I were to play devil's advocate here, I think the reason why M. Night Shyamalan went the direction he went in with his portrayal of these characters, specifically Aang and Zuko, is because he knew that concept-wise Avatar was never really anime-influenced, and that the only reason it chose to portray itself is that was simply for style and entertainment. And for animation it worked out really well, but for live action it does not. And I think that's why some people are divided on the look of Netflix's One Piece. As great of a successor it is to the anime, it still had its moments where it relied too heavily on the success of foreign actors to carry the beloved property over to live action. And this wouldn't be the only anime adaptation. As we all know, Cowboy Bebop was a massive disappointment with its portrayal of the characters, most notably Spike Spiegel, to which I must say, what the actual fuck. Casting foreign actors for anime properties can be a good thing if handled really well, but can be a bad thing if handled poorly. And in Cowboy Bebop's case, it was an absolute disaster. John Cho did a really good job playing Spike Spiegel to the best of his ability, but ultimately he was not the best casting choice. They really could have gone for a lesser-known actor, but instead they got a known actor for this role. And Spike Spiegel is such an iconic character, it's just dumb to cast a guy like John Cho who remotely looks nothing like the character in real life. But Netflix casted John Cho as Spike because of brand synergy. Anyway, my point is that as great as anime is on its own, it can't always be adapted the same way on screen, because it's being shown to a mass audience where some people may be turned off from some of the things that are portrayed accurately. And the same could be said about comics. As entertaining as they can be, the imagery aspect of them isn't always cinema-worthy. I've said before about how I think we need more compelling stories in comic book films and not the goofy trash that's unfortunately invading the big screen with pictures like Thor: Love and Thunder, The Marvels, and The Freakin' Flash. But I say all of this to say that even though I understand why they went in the foreign direction with these characters in this series, it wasn't exactly the best way to market the product to the mainstream. Now when people think of Avatar: The Last Airbender, they're going to be thinking about this every time it's brought up in conversation. So thanks a lot, Netflix, you really outdid yourselves. As for the other characters, I actually think everyone did a fantastic job for what they were given. Especially Sokka and Katara. The casting of Sokka and Katara in this is amazing and far better than The Last Airbender's portrayal of these characters. Most specifically Sokka, considering that he was every bit as charismatic as his animated counterpart. He may not be as sexist in comparison, but he is still entertaining to watch. And Katara in this series couldn't be any more accurate to her animated counterpart than M. Night Shyamalan's Katara. Nicola Peltz did a stand-up job as Katara, but unfortunately her acting was not enough to excuse how inaccurate she was from the source material. And the same can very well be said about M. Night Shyamalan's Sokka. His portrayal of these characters was so flat and wooden that literally the only characters that were any interesting to watch on screen at all were Aang and Zuko. And that's not really saying much because they're not really all that visually appealing themselves. Specifically Zuko. I don't mean to sound racist saying this, but I will never understand why Mr. Shyamalan thought it would be a good idea to have the Fire Nation be portrayed by Indians. Again, I understand the temptation of wanting to spice up some aspects of the property, but like Star Wars Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of those properties that you can only do so much of that with before realizing you've gone too far off the rails. People say that there's no such thing as a perfect live-action portrayal of Avatar: The Last Airbender, but if this series were to actually have real dedicated fans of the animated series making it alongside the original creators, where they could help make their ideas from the animated series look good on screen in much better ways compared to what we got with Netflix, it really isn't as impossible as people often preach. Having said that, even though I enjoyed this series, there is very much a part of me that thinks this series could have been better if portrayed a bit differently. I'm really not too thrilled about the future of this series, but I'm also not 100% doubtful of it. I'm hoping that whatever they do in the later seasons of this series, it will be remarkably better than what the animated series portrayed in seasons 2 and 3. Because those seasons are what elevated the series and made it out to be every bit as popular as people remember today.